He has terrorized many Latino communities throughout this city, and he has cost the taxpayers high dollars in legal fees.
Attorney Benjamin Taylor, who is critical of Arpaio, says he wasn't surprised to learn he is running again, but he says if he wins, Tent City would come back and lawsuits would follow. He also says that Arpaio would bring fear into the Latino community and bad publicity to the state of Arizona.
He might have been pardoned by the president, but he wasn't pardoned by the people. And this will fire up people who want to go to the polls and make sure that he's not reelected again.
Taylor says he believes Arpaio enjoys the publicity of running, but says our community doesn't need him anymore.
Now, our chief investigative reporter Morgan Lowe has been covering Sheriff Arpaio for 20 years. Thanks for joining us here tonight to kind of go over some of this with us.
Yeah, 24 years. There's a lot to unpack here in the history of the Valley. Let's begin with some of the controversy and particularly the contempt of court case.
Yeah, so Sheriff Arpaio was taken to court by the ACLU, accused of violating the rights of Latinos in the community. At some point during that process, the federal judge in the case issued a order that said you need to stop doing these immigration patrols. At that point, the sheriff's office continued the patrols. He was called in for contempt of court and was convicted of contempt of court. And then, of course, we know that President Trump later gave him the old pardon, so he pardoned him.
Do you think that that history and all of those controversies, obviously his critics are quick to mention that history, but do you think his supporters, his base, minds that he was found in contempt?
So he was voted out of office before any of that happened. And what that points to is there was fatigue. It wasn't fatigue over his get tough on crime policies. It was fatigue over these pet projects that he had, the immigration patrols. Because like the immigration patrols, for example, he had to move resources away from the child sex crimes unit, for example. So there were 400 child rapes that fell through the cracks and were not investigated. He used resources to investigate President Obama's birth certificate. So it was those stunts that created this fatigue, and he lost to a Democrat in Republican Maricopa County, almost unheard of, especially in a law enforcement position.
So it says a lot about the fatigue they must have been feeling because they'd obviously elected him 6 times before that loss to Sheriff Penzone. So the question now, going into 2020, is this going to be a big difference maker? Obviously, Penzone's running again. Is this a real challenge for him?
So the bottom line is probably no. This creates a problem for Jerry Sheridan, who's the other Republican who is running, because he and Arpaio, very similar. Arpaio's going to take his support. But the reality is there's one Republican who hasn't thrown his hat in yet, and it's the one that all the Republican the people behind the scenes are looking to, and that is our U.S. Marshal David Gonzalez. He was appointed by President Bush, reappointed by Obama, reappointed by Trump. He's the U.S. Marshal for Arizona, a position that's sort of the federal version of a sheriff, and he's been contemplating jumping into the race. He would likely be the front runner ahead of Arpaio in the Republican primary and probably set up a really interesting matchup in the general election with Paul Penzone.
But we know also that Arpaio's name recognition is unmatched, and so is his ability to fundraise.
Absolutely. And so I believe that Arpaio believes he could win this election, and I know that the people around him believe that they can raise enough money to make it a viable campaign. The question is, can they translate that into votes? And in 2016, they could not because he lost the race for sheriff. And in 2018, they could not because he lost the race for Senate. So yes, he knows how to raise a lot of money and has a mailing list that politicians all over the country would die for. But that doesn't mean that he's going to get the votes.
All right, very interesting perspective. Of course, Morgan Lowe, you've been covering this for so long, for over 20 years that he's been sheriff. So thanks for that perspective on that. We're, of course, going to look into this more as we hit 10 o'clock as well, coming up on our sister station, CBS 5, and here on 3 TV. And for the latest on this announcement by Joe Arpaio that he'll be running for Maricopa County Sheriff in 2020, head to the App Store, grab the AZ Family mobile app. We have push alerts that send right to your phone so you can stay up to date on this and other stories.